Hey guys, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I'm Greg. I've done a whole week of Pulitzer-themed videos in anticipation of the announcement of the new Pulitzer Prizes on April 15th. So today I wanted to talk about some Pulitzer Prize winners for fiction that are on my TBR pile. And I'm going to start with one that is not a surprise if you followed my channel at all. It's Beloved by Toni Morrison. Now, I started the audiobook of this in February, which is read by Toni Morrison, and she does a great job of it, but I didn't feel like the audio was giving me the deep reading experience that I wanted, so I picked up a copy of the book, and hopefully I will be getting to it this year. This is, it has been named, the New York Times Book Review named it one of the top books of the last 25 years. I forget what year that came out. It's widely regarded as a classic of American literature. I really want to get to it, hopefully sometime this year. So there is that one, and then there's The Orphan Master Son by Adam Johnson. I have been intrigued by this book ever since I first heard of it. I heard of it for the first time during the Tournament of Books, which it won the year it was released. That happened before it actually won the Pulitzer Prize. I haven't gotten around to reading it ever since it came out. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about this is that it's about North Korea, which at the time this was published was still very mysterious and insular. And in the years since it came out, North Korea, it's not that it has opened itself up, but it has changed its perception among the world. It has had a lot more of a public face. Donald Trump has met with the leader changed. Donald Trump has met with the leader. So it'd be interesting to read this book, not only to get that insight into North Korea, but to see the ways in which it has already changed drastically since this book came out. So that's The Orphan Master Son by Adam Johnson. And then we have The Known World by Edward P. Jones, which I think I've mentioned previously on this. It sounds fascinating because it explores slavery in ways in which it has not really been explored or talked about before. It really heavily examines the issues around ownership of slaves by both white people and black people. Sounds interesting. That's The Known World by Edward P. Jones. And then there's 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. Now, I have always been intrigued by books that are a twist on a classic. So this should be right up my alley. It is an updated telling of the story of King Lear. So I should be all over it. But here's the thing. There was a movie version of this in the late 90s, and I saw it on a plane. And back in those days, they only showed one movie, and you couldn't get away from it, and that was it. And I remember thinking that it was terminally boring. I was a teenager at the time, so my opinion might change if I tried to watch it now. So that has always made me hold back from this book, that and the fact that I know it really heavily deals with some issues of abuse. So, I want to give it a try, I feel, but that has always made me hesitate and pause. If you've read this, please let me know what you thought of it. I'd be very interested to know if it's something I should really prioritize and bump up my list. And then there's American Pastoral by Philip Roth. I have a kind of complicated love-hate relationship with Philip Roth. I DNF'd The Human Stain. I really wasn't liking it. But I actually really enjoyed Indignation, which is one of his lesser-known books. So, but this one feels like something I should read. This book came in second on the New York Times Book Review's list of the top 25 books of the last 25 years. Again, I don't remember when that list came out. And a lot of people widely regard it as a great American novel. It sounds interesting. It's basically, the inciting incident in this book is a teenager who sets off a bomb at a Vietnam War protest and kills an innocent bystander. But interestingly, and I haven't read this, so I don't really know, but it sounds like this story is being told second or even third hand, so it's kind of a reimagining or a recreation of those events that happened, which sounds like a very interesting way of telling a story. So, definitely intrigued to check this one out. Now let's talk about John Updike, because two of his books about Harry Rabbit Angstrom have won Pulitzer Prizes. The first one is Rabbit is Rich. The second one is Rabbit at Rest. I have never read a book by John Updike, which feels like a giant blank spot in my readership. I'm really cautious to get into him because I've heard that he has really horrible portrayals of women in his books. And I've developed this intolerance for books about white dudes who can't get their lives together. And that's basically who Harry Rabbit Angstrom is. So I have this wild resistance to the idea of reading these books, but I feel like I should get around to them. I'm not convinced I'm actually going to like them. They are about a high school basketball player and each book follows his life to, I think, Rabbit at Rest, he actually dies. But I feel like I'm obligated to do these at some point. If you've read them, please let me know what you think of them. Then there is The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love by Oscar Hijuelos. This was a book that was recommended to me a long time ago by someone who had recommended a bunch of really good books to me, but I just never have gotten around to it. It sounds interesting. This follows the lives of two Cuban brothers who are musicians. It's about the experience of immigration and cultural displacement, which are two things I'm really interested in. And I've heard that the book really tries to evoke the rhythm of Cuban music, which sounds like a fascinating way to write a book. I'm very interested in stories about identity, whether that be cultural identity or sexual identity or what have you. So this sounds like it would be right in my wheelhouse. And then we have Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. I have a big, gaping blind spot in my life as a reader where I really don't know much about Westerns. I haven't read a lot of Westerns, and it feels like I should try to get a couple of them in, and Larry McMurtry is one of the most famous authors within the Western genre, so it feels like he would be a safe place to start. This is a really hefty book about a cattle drive from Texas to Montana. It explores themes of old age and death, unrequited love, and friendship. And as an aside, this was one of my grandfather's favorite books before he died, and he was also a huge fan of the TV miniseries adaptation, so this would probably have a great personal connection for me. Then there's Ironweed by William Kennedy. The Modern Library named this one of the top 100 novels of the 20th century. It's actually the third book in Kennedy's Albany cycle. It follows the life of an alcoholic vagrant who is returning to Albany, having abandoned his family many years earlier after accidentally killing his infant son. It sounds a little bit brutal, but I've heard really good things about it. It sounds like an interesting book. Definitely want to get to it. Then we have The Keepers of the House by Shirley Ann Growell. This is a 1964 novel set in rural Alabama, and it follows 7 generations of a family there. They've lived in the same house, I believe, for all of that time, and it really explores established families of the Deep South and critiques them and their values and their morals, especially the ways in which they can be hypocritical, especially on the subject of race. I stumbled on this in my favorite bookstore, which is Northshire Books in Vermont, one day, and I was reading the description and I just had to pick it up. And that was about a year ago. I'd love to get to it at some point. Then there is A Death in the Family by James Agee. I hope that's the correct way to pronounce that name. This is an autobiographical novel that was not quite finished when Agee died in 1955. There are disputes about how much of this book may have been altered by Agee's editor. So I believe there are actually 2 versions of this book now. Somebody did a deep dive and tried to publish the version that they think Agee intended to publish about 10 years ago, I believe. But this is a story about a time in 1915 when Agee went to visit his father after his father suffered a heart attack. And on his return trip, his father died in a car crash. So it heavily deals with the idea of loss and family and life in Knoxville, Tennessee. It's always really intrigued me, so I would love to get to this book at some point. Then there's one of the big American classics, which is oddly about a Cuban man. It's The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, a very slim little novel, also one of Ernest Hemingway's most well-known titles. It follows an aging Cuban fisherman who is desperately trying to bring in a marlin off in the Gulf Stream off the coast of Cuba. And then there's The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I have read a lot of books by John Steinbeck, but I haven't read his 2 heftiest volumes, which are also his 2 biggest classics, East of Eden and The Grapes of Wrath. And this one speaks to me particularly because I'm really fascinated with the Dust Bowl. And this book is about the Joad family, who basically is losing everything and facing hard times because of the Great Depression and because of the Dust Bowl. So they set out for California to change their fortunes. And it's always sounded really interesting to me, but I just haven't gotten around to it. And then there's Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. Now, true story, my older sister read this book when I was still a kid. I was maybe 8 years old, and for a long time I felt profoundly insulted by the first sentence of this book, which is, Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful. And I was really offended by this because I always think of Scarlett O'Hara as Vivien Leigh from the movie, and I was like, Vivien Leigh is beautiful. How dare you? So I was like morally opposed to this book just because of that. Only as an adult did I actually read the rest of the first paragraph and actually understand what it was trying to say. So there you go. That's just a fun story. But part of why this is obviously a classic of American literature and American cinema, but part of why I'm really interested to read it at some point is because, just like the story I was saying, I want to see how much of my experience of Gone with the Wind would be colored by my knowledge of the movie, because that's something my sisters and I used to watch a lot when I was a kid. So that would be fascinating to see. And then there's The Magnificent Andersons by Booth Tarkington. This is a novel that follows changes in society by following the aristocratic Amberson family. They are seeing their fortunes decline over 3 generations, and at the same time you can see rising fortunes among more industrial families, or quote-unquote new money families. And the book really explores the difference between being something and doing something, which to me sounds like a very fascinating dynamic that is still very relevant today. So I would love to read this at some point. And then those are the books that I'm going to talk about that are on my TBR. I'm going to give an honorary mention to The Reivers by William Faulkner, but only because I have never read a book by William Faulkner, which is, I'm ashamed. But the thing is, The Reivers is not the book of his that I would like to read the most. It's not even the second or third book of his that I would like to read the most. So I'm just going to give it an honorary mention because I feel like I want to read a book by William Faulkner at some point. So those are the books that have won a Pulitzer that I really want to read, kind of to make myself a better, more well-rounded reader, and some of which just sound like really fascinating books that I think I might like. Are there any that you would recommend I give a shot? Do you think I should stay away from any of these, any of that? Please let me know. Let's talk about that. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you are already subscribed, I really thank you for your time. If not, I hope you liked this enough to hit subscribe or check out some of my other videos. I'm going to be back again, and until then, happy reading.